your touch, my sleeping spirit was awakened. On my darkened heart, the light of Christ has shone.
Check your notes. I think we should be coming up to the end soon.
To a kingdom that cannot
It's
be
the last
shaken.
few sessions.
Heaven sent
Okay.
by grace and grace alone. So I'll
Okay, everyone. We will begin in a few moments. I just have to grab something from my car.
The weakest man I know is the man I see in the mirror. But it's okay to be inferior when you know Christ is superior. Much stronger than my fears and doubts. He's the overcomer. He holds me up when I'm overwhelmed by the weight my soul is under.
All right, so we're going to start, and I'm going to just pray for, open us up in prayer, and then we'll get started with our exercise. All right, everyone. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and once again, another chance to study your scriptures, to study your word, and to look at it from different perspectives and different facets to hopefully understand you and your purposes for us a little bit better. We love you and give you all the glory and praise. In your name we pray, amen. So today, our exercise will be a little different. We're going to be reading, we won't be reading, but we'll be doing a quick little study of Sandman. Okay? Quick little study of Sandman. So, you can look up Sandman right now, but Sandman it's trending on Netflix because it's a show on Netflix.
The music.
Yeah, not the music. But Sandman is it's written by Neil Gaiman, and Neil Gaiman he's an English writer. He's an English writer who wrote many, many books. Short fiction, he wrote novels, he wrote graphic novels, nonfiction, he did theater, he's worked on films. So Neil Gaiman wrote this graphic novel, Sandman. Who knows what a graphic novel is? But what separates it from comics?
Oh, so it's so they are usually gory graphic.
No, actually. So graphic doesn't mean that in this instance. So what graphic means in this instance is long-form comic books. So usually comic books are episodic, meaning they're short volumes, and then they're serialized week after week after week. No. So graphic novels are long-form comics. So usually they show up in volumes. Okay, so larger chunks of comics. So Neil Gaiman, he wrote The Sandman. And what a graphic novel includes that regular novels often don't include are pictures. Okay? So Neil Gaiman is a really interesting character. And so he wrote this character called the Sandman. Has anybody seen the Netflix show? Not yet. Okay, good. So the Sandman it's brand new, so you can watch it right now. But we're going to do a case study that hopefully will tie into where we are in our lessons. Where are we in our lessons right now? What are we studying?
Number 26, repeated words between distant literary.
Yeah, between very distant literary units, right? So what graphic novels afford us is an opportunity to look at long-form narrative and seeing the different literary units and story arcs that occur within a graphic novel. So hopefully this little practice will get us into the zone. So, the Sandman. Does anybody know roughly what the Sandman is about?
It's a fantasy drama.
Yeah, is that the show? It says that's what the show is? So it is a fantasy drama. It's sort of like that. I don't know if you guys know this, my parents knew this, but I was reading Sandman in middle school. I had a classmate who had copies of the Sandman, and Mr. Huffine loved the Sandman. So he was my 8th grade history teacher, and he loved Sandman. And so I first heard of Sandman through him. And so this was maybe one of the earliest pieces of art that I was intensely interested in, that I wasn't introduced to me by my parents, like the Beatles or Lord of the Rings. This was the first time I had discovered a piece of art I had discovered it on my own. And it was a very interesting thing. It's the first thing that affected me so powerfully that I was driven to understand why I owe so much to Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is the author. So why I like horror in my adult life, I think, is largely due in part to Neil Gaiman's influence on me when I was 13, 14. And so Sandman is a sweeping epic. It's a huge, long-form story about the Lord of Dreams, right? He's the Lord of Dreams. And he often gets called the Sandman. So he's the Lord of Dreams. He's the being who is above, who governs the dreams of men. And so it led me here to this man whose name is Dream. The Sandman's real name is Dream, or Morpheus. The Matrix absolutely read Neil Gaiman's Sandman, which is why you have a character who leads people through dreams, and he's Morpheus, right? And so Morpheus, he says he's more commonly called Morpheus in the series, has done a lot for people in terms of the way people think about dreams in the modern era, in modern popular fiction, is largely due in part to Neil Gaiman's work in The Sandman, because he makes a connection that almost no one had done prior to Neil Gaiman's work. And so he played on both meanings of the word dream. What are the two meanings of dream? Okay, rapid eye movement is a technical thing. So people dream when they're in REM sleep, but you might be in REM and not dream. So what is a dream? What are the two meanings of dream? Yeah, okay, dreams are they're the visions,
While you are asleep.
yeah, we have when sleep, right?
Sleep.
Yeah, so dreams can be the visions you have when you're asleep, right? That happen in REM sleep. But they happen when we're asleep. But what's the other meaning of dream?
Daydreaming. Is that what you're saying?
Sure? Yes, they're the wishes that consume us.
What is your dream?
Yeah, they're the wishes that consume us in our waking. So Neil Gaiman, the Sandman, he is the Lord of Dreams, and people think that only governs sleep. But Neil Gaiman also played with the Lord of Dreams as the person who also governs our waking aspirations. And so there's so much to explore when Neil Gaiman makes that just, all he's doing is playing on the word. And what he does in Sandman, he hones in on this double meaning, And we can zero in on that on another time. But what I want to do today is revisit one of our earliest exercises. What is one of the first poems or first authors that we looked at in our exercises?
Someone. Oh, no.
No, not from the Bible.
It's a sonnet.
It was a sonnet of Shakespeare. So what I want to do is look at one of Neil Gaiman's most prominent characters in Sandman, which is William Shakespeare. So in the series of The Sandman, William Shakespeare is a common and consistent presence throughout the story of Sandman. And the way that William Shakespeare is used by Gaiman communicates some themes about writing and dreams and genius. So Shakespeare makes 3 appearances throughout the long epic narrative of Sandman, 3 different appearances in the books. So episode 13, 19, and 75. So quite a long jump. The last appearance is 75, and this is the story's over, right? So you can think about how these are already fairly thick volumes, and it's a long-told story. In a lot of ways, it's longer than The Lord of the Rings. It's longer than certain books of the Game of Thrones. This is a long narrative. So there's opportunity for a lot of reconnection, right? So it makes 3 appearances, 13, 19, and 75. The first time we see William Shakespeare is towards the beginning of the series in 13. The context of his appearance is in actually another person's conversation, in another person's story. So Dream is sitting with his sibling. So Dream is sitting with his sibling, his older sibling who is Death, right? Because Death is the cousin of sleep, right? So you have Dream is sitting with his sister Death, and then they're making an agreement in a 14th century tavern, saying that the only reason people die is because everyone does it. So it's derivative. The only reason people die is because everyone does it. And everybody just goes along with it, and they don't have enough heart to question why they die. It's rubbish. Death is stupid. I want nothing to do with it. That's what Death says about death. And so, overhearing the conversation, there's a man whose name is Hob Gatling. And Death and Dream he plays a game with a man named Hob. Since you're complaining about death, we will never let you die until you crave it. So until being alive is too much for you, then we'll take you. But until then, so that he thinks he understands death fully. So Dream and Death agree to meet him in the same bar once a year, in the same tavern once a year. Once every 100 years to discuss how he's feeling about life, whether he's ready to die or not. Until their second meeting in 1589, around the time of Shakespeare, where a man named Willem Shaxburg overhears this conversation, intuiting that they have been meeting in this bar for hundreds of years. And so Shaxburg is pining to his friend Kit Marlowe about his great wish to give men dreams that would live on after he dies. So that's Willem Shaxburg's dream, is to give men dreams that live on longer than he dies, longer than he lives. So then Dream abandons the game with Hob. That's more interesting because it has to do with dreams directly. And so Dream strikes a bargain with William Shakespeare. And the details of the bargain, we don't learn until far along in the story, until their second meeting. In their second meeting, it's in the South Downs of Sussex, England, where 1600, yeah. So exactly, 16-something, where a troupe of players is preparing his new play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And this play, we learn, was written for Dream. That was one of the bargain. Part of the bargain is you need to write me a play about dreams. And it's actually, he was promised 3 plays about dreams. Just over the course of 100 years, you will give me 3 plays. And so these dreams, in exchange for Shakespeare becoming the figure we know today. Dream will give him everything he desires, so long as he can write 3 plays about dreams. And he becomes the vessel for great stories of mankind. And so Shakespeare's troupe is inspired to play this play, to perform for the real inhabitants of the fairy world, like Dream and Hades and Zeus and all of these characters. And one of the characters in Midsummer Night's Dream is a fairy king named Oberon. And now he's watching a play about him, who's visiting the earthly realm. And so now we have this play that's being played for these fantastic creatures, and it takes place towards the middle of the series. Dream begins to question if he was right for giving Shakespeare what he wanted, because he did not understand the cost. Mortals never understand the cost of their dreams. They only see the prize. Right? They only see the prize of their heart's desire, but they never see the cost of getting what you want. Because the cost of dreaming is only getting what you once wanted. It's once you finally get it, it's no longer what you want. You only wanted it. And it's this tragic, it's never enough. Because once you have it, you no longer want it, you once wanted it. And there's something else to take its dreaming. And so there's a tragic thing that Dream now feels guilt for giving Shakespeare what he wanted. And so Shakespeare's inclusion in this series is an analog for both Dream but also Neil Gaiman as a budding author who is making a lot of headway in the world for different DC comics, for different graphic novels, for different long stories, for different short stories. And we get a meditation not only on genius and what it takes to be a genius, but also on the cost of genius and the cost of achieving your dreams. For Gaiman, that cost is isolation, multiple wives, estranged children, alienation from friends. And so for Gaiman, all forms of isolation occur in getting your dreams. And for Shakespeare, in his real life, he had a son named Hamnet, who Hamlet was roughly based off of, but they were estranged. And so Shakespeare's son seems to regard Hamnet as a nuisance. And Hamnet laments to another actor that, why is my father so distant? He doesn't seem like he's really there anymore. Not really, it's like he's somewhere else. And that anything that happens to him, he merely makes into a play and makes stories out of it. In Hamnet's mind, Hamnet was less real than any of the plays, because that was the most important thing to Shakespeare. And so, in his eagerness to write great stories, Shakespeare becomes isolated, achieving a dream but relinquishing any form of real humanity. And his life as such was the cost of extreme focus. Extreme focus and genius isolates you from the people who you love, isolated from their context. And at the intermission of the play, Midsummer Night's Dream, Dream breaks the news to Shakespeare that his friend Christopher Marlowe has just been killed. And we don't understand why. And what for Shakespeare, the release of Midsummer Night's Dream signaled the loss and the falling away of his contemporaries. How many of you knew who Christopher Marlowe was? How many of you? But only vaguely, right? And do you know who Edmund Spenser is? Another contemporary of Shakespeare. But for some reason, no one remembers any of his great contemporaries, but Shakespeare is the one who stands above. And in that position, he's lonely. So the success of one person often marks the downfall of others and contemporaries. And Christopher Marlowe is almost completely absent from historical record, or at least in modern cultural memory. His presence has been overshadowed outside of academia by William Shakespeare. And he's overshadowed by isolated success, isolated genius. And so Gaiman picks up on this theme again of isolated genius. He picks up again in the final appearance of Shakespeare in 75. 75 also happens not only to be the final appearance of Shakespeare, but it's also the last episode of Sandman. So Shakespeare is there at the close with his final play. And Shakespeare's final play, does anybody know what it is? It's The Tempest. And so it's not accidental, right, that Shakespeare's dreaming is also the final episode. This is where Shakespeare is writing his final play at the end of his career that fulfills the bargain with dream. And then he can die, right? And his friend, his critic, Ben Johnston, comes to visit him and asks Shakespeare about the new play. He says, have you been raiding poor Holinshed again? Or does Plutarch bear the brunt of your depredations? And so what his critic says is, are you borrowing from these older stories again? Or are you making a new one? Because that's what Shakespeare is known for, right? Taking from Plutarch, taking from old historians, and dramatizing the history. That's Julius Caesar, right? That's King Lear. That's, what's the other? Othello, right? Merchant of Venice. These are all older stories. They're not original. Shakespeare is merely borrowing. But for some reason, nobody remembers the original. When somebody thinks of Julius Caesar, they say, et tu, Brutus, right? Et tu, Brutus. And if you say et tu, Brutus, we don't know if Julius Caesar ever said that. Only Shakespeare said Julius Caesar said that, right? And so we have, there's almost like a history that matters more than the truth. A history that matters, the story that matters more than the truth of the reality. And so here we have the critique of Shakespeare is that these references that Shakespeare makes in his plays are famously belonging to other authors. And many of his plots in prior sources and histories are those of Raphael Holinshed and Plutarch and Josephus and things like that. And yet these major historical figures are like small planets in relative to Shakespeare's gravitas, right? We don't remember everybody else. So Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Plutarch don't register against Shakespeare, right? So it's an example back in the first issue. In 1789, at their fourth meeting, Hob Gatling tells this dream he has. He's seen a production of King Lear. So this man, Hob, he's actually the original author of King Lear. But nobody knows that, except for people who study history. The shape of King Lear, almost plot for plot, is from Hob Gatling. And so he says, the idiots have given King Lear a new happy ending, right? A happy ending that will not last. And Dream says to Hob Gatling, the great stories always return to their original forms. That's a phrase out of Dream's mind. So Gaiman is playing with us here. Unless we know the real story of King Lear and the story of Hob Gatling and the story of William Shakespeare, you don't get the irony in what Dream is saying, right? Because he knows what the average man thinks of King Lear is coming from Shakespeare. And so Hob Gatling is saying Shakespeare changed the ending. But actually, it was not Shakespeare who changed the ending. The original versions of King Lear, upon which it was based, did have a happy ending. So it wasn't a tragedy before. King Lear always ended happy until Shakespeare. But those are the versions we forgot. And yet, by having Dream say the great stories will return always to their original forms, Gaiman indicates perhaps the key theme of the whole series. The key theme of the entire Sandman series, as at least the graphic novels, I haven't seen all of the show, is the power of dreams to supplant reality. To supplant reality. If a dream is powerful enough, it does not matter what the truth is. That's the whole thing of the Sandman. That's why the sleeping moments are just as powerful as the waking moments of aspiration. Right? It's the power of dreams to supplant reality. In the second issue that Shakespeare occurs, Oberon, the king of the fairies, watches the Shakespeare play about him. And he's lamenting, it didn't happen that way. Things never happened thus, he says. And then Dream responds to Oberon, oh, it may not have happened thus, but it is true. Things need not have happened in order to be true. Tales and dreams are the shadow truths that will endure long past when mere facts are dust and ashes and forgotten. And so it happens to be that if the dream is large enough, it can really supplant what really happened. The message trumps the medium in that sense. And in the very next panel features a line from Midsummer Night's Dream that criticizes the power of stories. This is from Shakespeare himself. The best in this kind are but shadows, and the worst are no worse if imagination amend them. And so Neil Gaiman is, like Shakespeare, disagrees that these shadows, these illusions of reality, incomplete as they are, or ungrounded in reality as they may come in time to replace the real thing itself. Indeed, Shakespeare was the vessel for the extremely powerful stories. His treatments of many historical figures are the only things we think about when we think of those historical figures. The crossing of the Rubicon is Shakespeare, right? It's not Caesar. That's Shakespeare, right? And so these treatments of love and madness and dreams have in many ways created the age in which we still live, where the story can be stronger than the truth of the thing. Right? The story can be stronger than the truth of a thing. You've seen people driven mad by the stories they tell themselves, right? So many stories of aspiration in the movies that we watch are about characters who have dreamed such a big dream that it consumes them. And they might even go as far as to tell themselves that they are God, or that they are the best general there ever was, right? And that's why one of my favorite poems by Percy Shelley is Ozymandias. It's a story of a king who once had a kingdom, and he erected a giant statue of this king. But then what we see in the poem is a man who's wandering the wastes of sand, and he sees just barely the face of a statue buried beneath the sands. And then when he unearths it, it says, "Behold, it is I, Ozymandias, King of Kings. Bow down at my might." Right? And so the challenge is, the dream was big, but it wasn't real. Right? And so in this very real sense, we're living in the dreams of Shakespeare. And Sandman is a singular work of art coming and propelling comics into a higher literary appreciation. Up until this point, comics were not epic narratives. They were episodic. They were for people to try out different versions of a character. Right? That's more akin to what we know about silhouettes, right? Where there's a silhouette of Batman, but then who wears the cowl? Is it Robert Pattinson? Is it Ben Affleck? Or is it Christian Bale? But these are all different versions of the Batman silhouette, right? All different reflections on Batman. And so Neil Gaiman really propelled graphic novels into a story. That's why we have The Walking Dead. That's why we have stories like the Game of Thrones comics of Sir Duncan Egg. These are the higher literary appreciations of comics. And pulling like Shakespeare's work on a vast catalog of mythological and religious and literary figures like Neil Gaiman and Sandman, it's fitting that Gaiman is more interested in Shakespeare the man than he's interested in Shakespeare the playwright, right? And Gaiman, like I said, these are all analogs for one another. Gaiman identifies with Dream and identifies with Shakespeare, and he writes it thus. And in each in turn, they have to examine the costs of telling the great stories they wish to tell. And the largest part of the cost, it seems, is isolation. If we live in a dream of our own making, it's singular and lonely, right? And so this is what Shakespeare says at the close of his life. "I watched my life as if it were happening to someone else." And then Shakespeare tells Dream, "My son died and I was hurt, but actually I only watched my hurt. I even relished it a little, for now I could write a real death in my stories, a true loss." And 3 issues that span in 3 issues that span a series of 75 pages, maybe 100 pages per issue. That's how many pages? 75 issues? 75 issues and 100 pages per issue? 7,500 pages, right? And in 3 issues, Neil Gaiman links Shakespeare as a literary unit, right? William Shakespeare, linking dreams and genius and isolation and reality, all by just 3 repetitions over the course of 3 issues, over the course of 7,500 pages. The themes of genius and isolation within a larger framework of a story that's essentially about stories. Sandman is trying to take his dreams back because he was captured and all the dreams got out, and he has to pull them back into the dreams, into the dream world. And so this highlights the uneasy relationship between stories, which are collective dreams, really, right? The stories we tell ourselves about who we are as a country or who we are as a church, they're all collective dreaming. They're all aspirational at some level, right? And the relationship between those collective dreamings and history and the imaginations that have amended history, right? There's all types of ways where we apologize for past failures because we told ourselves a story that makes it make sense, right? And so Gaiman masterfully weaves in 3 issues these concerns of isolation, genius, and reality and truth. And so he brings them to life in the pages of Sandman, a graphic novel, which is something that most people don't take seriously as literature, but most people don't even know who Christopher Marlowe is. And yeah, he becomes, Faust, right? Yeah. Yeah, and so this is where we are. Repetition over long distances. Neil Gaiman could do it in 3 issues, only repeated 3 times over the course of 7,500 pages. What we have is the Bible. And we're going to be studying large portions. Where did we end off last week? We ended off in Genesis 6, right? Genesis 6. And we talked about the relationship between these. Did you guys do the homework? Yeah, looking at the sons of Elohim. Right? So we looked at sons of Elohim and host of heaven. So here we are. Right? So we looked at the repetition. So what are the repeated words in the Genesis 6 narrative of the children of Elohim? Yeah, right? So there's the repetition of the seeing, there's a repetition of the good, of Tov, and then and there's the woman again, right? Instead of just the one woman, it's actually now the women, right? Or the daughters. Yeah. Yeah, and then the taking. But instead of the human figure failing, right? Instead of the human figure seeing something as good, right? Because the very first time we see somebody seeing something as good, who is the person who sees it? What character sees as good? God. That's the first. So he's the silhouette. But who's the second person who sees as good? Eve, the woman, right? But who's the third character who sees as good? The seeing as good is actually omitted from the Cain narrative, right? So it's similar but different. But you can assume that Cain saw whatever he did to his brother as good, right? It's absent there. And then in the next narrative, you get who seeing as good? The sons of Elohim, right? And so this is really important because we're talking about the goodness of something. What are we talking about here? Yeah, so the last time before this, before this story, before Genesis 6, Who was the last person to see as good? We already said it. Eve. Eve. So specifically, explicitly in the text, Eve is the one to see as good. In the presence of whom?
The presence of the serpent,
Yeah, the snake,
the snake,
right?
and Adam.
And the snake talks. And because, what do we know about the snake?
Crafty.
Cunning. Yeah, crafting. Okay? It only says crafty. He ends up deceiving the woman, but text-wise, right? We're looking for repetition. So, crafty. So, wise. This snake has some form of knowledge of something. What else? What else do we know? He talks. Right? Do snakes talk? No. So that's not typical, right? So whatever this snake is, it's a snake who is not only wise, it's unusual, right? He talks.
He talks, and not only that, he seems to be welcoming. I don't know.
Yeah,
His personality.
yeah.
Is not something that is offensive.
Yeah, it wasn't scary to Eve, right? When our characters in Scripture see an angel, the angel has to say, "Don't be afraid," because they're scared, right? When Zechariah first sees the angel saying, "You're going to have a son," he's scared, right? He's scared. Mary is not scared, but Zechariah is. The shepherds were scared, but here, no. Nothing. We don't get, so whatever he is not scary, right? It's unusual, but it's not off-putting, right? Yeah, maybe they've seen him before. Yeah, he's a familiar face. Exactly. Yes, it's okay to make that inference, right? Because the story leaves it open for us. That's the ambiguity. What else do we know? He seems to know something about, yes, he seems to know things, right? He's in the know, seemingly, right? Surely God didn't say that. He seems to know something, right? Which means he either consorts with God, right? Or counsels with him, or is, or maybe he's just making it up. At this point, we truly don't know, right? It's actually very vague, right? He says, God knows. Let me tell you what God knows and why he's telling you this, right? In Genesis 3, we have a woman who's being deceived by a snake who seems to be a little bit more, like snake plus, right? He seems to be a little bit more than a snake. And she sees what is good after the conversation, and then she takes. She has eyes on the thing. I see this as good, and I take, right? Right? So it's an exact inversion of Genesis 3, except now it's not a human rebellion. It's a spiritual rebellion in Genesis 6. The parallel is the snake figure, which is the sons of Elohim figure, is now the one who is seeing and taking, right? These spiritual beings being the sons of Elohim, right? The rabbit hole is quite deep here, but you see why we can say the snake is a little bit more than just a simple snake? Because the three repeated stories have a God slot, a divine being slot. The first one is the one God sees, right? The second is the snake, right? It's not explicit that it's a divine figure or like a spiritual being figure, but because of the first instance and the third instance, that's the thing that's left out, right? It's similar but different. They're parallels, right? And so if you do a concordance search on this phrase, B'nai Elohim, sons of Elohim, it always and only refers to spiritual beings in the divine council. This is something that maybe you never have heard, but I assure you, it's all across your Hebrew Bible, right? So people who want to argue that this is humans, and some translations will say that they're kings of old, right? The mighty men of renown or the kings of old. They might say that. That's not what it is. Or they'll say that the sons of God are actually kings. You cannot make that inference because that's not ever how it's used ever anywhere else, right? So there's spiritual being. Overwhelmingly, it's what the phrase B'nai Elohim always means in the Bible.
Is that the same as heavenly hosts?
Similar, yeah, the divine council, the host, the army of heaven, right? The host is an army, right? So in my mind, the narrative analogy of the snake and the woman really illuminates this passage for us. In Genesis 3, all the snake is called is a beast of the field, a behemoth, right? But when you start to back out, think about Genesis 4. What is the animal tempter in Genesis 4? It's chata, it's sin, right? There's this crouching animal figure in Genesis 4, right? All of a sudden, there's like this animate evil creature that's desiring for Cain, right? And then you have to sit with that portrait. There's the serpent, the beast that deceives Eve. And then you have this thing that desires after man, right? Cain, and he's a sin creature, right? And then you have Genesis 6, which is the sons of Elohim, who are desiring after the woman. And so, when you think of the sin, like the animate sin creature, that sounds like Romans 7. Right? Sin is like a creature in Romans 7, right? And then we're going to go on to the portrait of spiritual evil as rebellious spiritual beings in Genesis 6, where God said to the host of heavens in Genesis 1. What does God say to the host of heaven in Genesis 1? What does God say to the host of heaven?
In Genesis 1?
In Genesis 1. Right? We looked at it when we first were talking about the repetition of the word rule and govern. Right? The humans rule on earth. Who rules in heaven? No. Read. The lesser lights. The lesser lights are the ones who govern in the sky. Right? And so what we have is the lesser lights are up in the sky, but then on earth, we have man, right? They govern here, and then these creatures govern up here, right? And so what you have is a transgression. You want to be like them. They want to be like you. There's an inversion, right? There's a boundary violation. That's not what God had said is good, right? What's good is that they rule there, and you rule here. That's what's good. And it raises a million weird questions, but that's what's being repeated, right? This is how to interpret this passage. Whatever it does for your theology from this point is not the scope of the class, right? Well, I just want to draw attention to the narrative analogy. So here's our phrase again, and it's the same players as in Genesis 3. Let's identify the characters again. In Genesis 3 and in Genesis 6, who are the characters? So there's a spiritual being. In this case, it's plural, right? The sons of Elohim, right? And then there's the woman. But in this case, it's plural, the woman, right? But it's all inverted. And so look at verse 5. Now the Lord saw that the evil, right? Now the Lord saw that the evil, do you remember what's the name of the tree?
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? The word for evil is ra. Now the Lord saw that the ra of Adam was great on the land, right? That's what it says. The ra of, it says humanity there, but that's the word Adam, right? Now the Lord saw that the ra of humanity, or the ra of Adam, was great on the land, every intent of the thoughts of his heart only ra all the time. You could summarize it this way. It's as if in these four occurrences of this phrase in Genesis 1 through 6, Genesis 1, God is the knower and the seer of what is tov. And that leads to chava, or Eve, life, right? When God sees, it leads to Chava, Eve, or life. Be fruitful and multiply, right? Eve is the way for Adam to be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 3 becomes the contrast to that analogy. When not God sees what is good, the woman saw what was good and she took, it led to death, right? Opposite of Chava, right? Genesis 6 comes along and inverts Genesis 3. The sons of God now see the woman are good and they take. And this is happening when humanity is multiplying and doing the Genesis 1 thing. Except once you mix Genesis 3 and Genesis 6 as a combined heaven and earth rebellion, right? This is the combined rebellion of heaven and earth. What do you get on the land? Genesis 6.5. Evil of humanity all across the land. Right? And it was ruined, for the land was filled with violence, or Hamas. Right? And so, and Yahweh saw that the evil is multiplying on the land. Humans are multiplying, and when humans multiply, therefore evil is multiplying on the land. And the land was filled with violence. So are you seeing the argument here? That what we're seeing from Genesis 1 through 6 is continued escalation of the problem, right? Do you know have you ever seen a show where somebody gets bit by a poison, like in Walking Dead, and you have to cut off the part before it spreads? We didn't. We didn't catch it in time. It grew. The whole thing became dead, right? And so, in other words, the narrative is trying to make a theological argument, right? Through repetition, over large, distant stories, the author is trying to make a theological argument through the stories. Genesis 1 through 11 is really the story of humanity's spiral, right? Continued and gradual spiral. It's diagnosing the problem in God's good world. It's that death is proliferating. And when things are not good when what? Things are not tov when what? It's not beneficial to human life, right? And when Ra proliferates, it is not beneficial to human life. It's filled with what when Ra proliferates? Violence, right? And so both a human and spiritual rebellion results in this expansion and proliferation of not good. And that's Genesis 1 through 11. That's Genesis 1 through 11's explanation of why things are the way they are in our experience. Everywhere we turn, there's someone who's out for themselves. There's someone who's trying to get a one-up. There's someone who's not doing what is right. There's someone who is, right? They're beside themselves with deceit. They're seeing what's good in their own eyes, right? And so the idea that this is kind of a heavenly rebellion paralleling a human rebellion, in fact, so maybe you've never heard about the heavenly rebellion part. But for most of interpretation history, that was the only way to view Genesis 6. It's modern when it fell out. Post-Enlightenment, we stopped thinking about spiritual things in that true sense, right? As far as we can tell, before the interpreters in the 3rd century AD, this was the only way to think about it, right? And this is where the idea that maybe they're not sons of Elohim and they're actually human rulers who get called sons of God, right? But I think you can argue that in the New Testament, the reflection of 2 Peter and in Jude, it's reflecting on this passage right here. Or even Ephesians, yeah. Yeah, exactly, yes. Yeah. Yes. And so there are other Jewish texts that really identify this as one of the major core issues, right? There's a part in 2 Peter where he quotes from a book that's not in our Bible called 1 Enoch. And 1 Enoch is about the Nephilim, right? It's about these creatures here, right? And then there's another reference in what is not in our books, but it's in the apocryphal text, but it's in the canon for Coptic Christians. It's called the Scroll of Jubilees. And the Scroll of Jubilees and a bunch of other texts are what any Jewish person in the time of Jesus would have been aware of and would have read. They fell from our story, right? We forgot about them, just like in Neil Gaiman's stories. We don't know Christopher Marlowe, but they're still important, right? So Genesis 1 through 11 tells us the story of this fall, of this tragic fall of humanity, right? It's not just Genesis 3 that's the fall of man, right? Noah is a tragic figure as well, right? He's supposed to be the start over, but when he gets to the top of the mountain, he plants a garden. It sounds like Genesis 1, but what happens when he gets to the top of the garden? He gets drunk and something happens with his son, right? And not good, right? Really not good. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's a challenging story we can get into another time. But Genesis 4 and Genesis 3 are inseparable from what happens with the sons of God in Genesis 6. They're inseparable. They're made to be read on analogy. And most of us only read 3 and 4, and we forget about 6 altogether. But what we get is a mounting escalation of the problem from Genesis 1 to 2 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 10. By the time you get to 11, humanity is already on their way up, building a tower. Right? They're going to try and climb. That's the issue of Genesis 6. But they're trying to go down. Right? But what do we know about going up and down for the heavenly beings when we read Jacob's ladder? They go up and down on the ladders all the time. But for some reason, they wanted to do this, and it was wrong. So there's a challenge here. Right? But it's the mounting escalation of the cosmic rebellion. Tucked in the middle of Genesis 3:6, and then in Genesis 6, here in the middle is Cain. In between 3 and Genesis 6 is Cain. And you have this picture of this person who introduces to us the character of sin. And before he even meets sin, what happens? God gives them an option. Right? If you do tov, good. Right? Clearly, God knew that, or clearly there was an anticipation that meeting Chata would be dangerous, so I should get Cain before, right? But it almost seems like the one whose mom made the choice to eat the fruit is now being told, you do realize that if you eat this, if you get eaten by sin, you will get eaten by sin if you don't make the choice to do tov, right? It's death if you don't do this. Right? And not because I'm punishing you, but because sin is there, crouching, and it's hungry. Its desire is for you. Right? And so you don't see people going, well, should we do this or should we do that? Right? Or thinking about, like, we don't have really obvious choices of good and bad in regular life. In regular life, it's oftentimes things you need lots of wisdom to discern a good way forward. Right? And it just seems like a bunch of people in Genesis are consumed with we take what we want, and we see that as good. And pretty much just become what he told Cain was going to happen. Sin crouches. Every time you think that, sin is crouching and is ready to devour. It's going to consume you. And now you have, by the time you get to 6 onward, you have a whole bunch of people who are consumed with the same question that Cain had, right? We just watched Cain disappear into a city, right? He disappears into the city, and then the city becomes multiple cities, and then they move, and you get met with a corrupt king named Lamech, right? It's tragic. We hear about Cain a little bit later, but what we're tracking here is the particular phrase. What does Cain do? Right? After he leaves God, the presence of God, what does Cain do? We just said it. He leaves and he builds a city. And he names it what? Enoch. Yeah, he names it after his son to perpetuate the name. And kind of think of any other cities that will be built to perpetuate the great name of me and mine. What's the city that gets built to build a name that's great? Babel, which is the same word for Babylon. There's only one Hebrew word for Babylon, and it's Babel. Why do your English translations not call every Babel? I don't know why. They're making a distinction here, but the biblical authors are not. This is one of the most repeated words in the Old Testament, Babel, because Babel is where Abraham's from, right? The Ur, one of the cities where Babel is located. It's the city where humanity was confused, right? It's also the city where they get exiled because they're behaving like Babel, right? It becomes a whole thing, right? It's this place called Babylon, right? And actually the Babylon narrative, let us make a name for ourselves, a city and a tower that goes up into the heavens, right? The head of the tower is in the skies. It's the inversion of Genesis 6, right? It's an escalation. Genesis 1, then 2, then 3, then 6, then 11, right? And 11 is when it all goes wrong, right? Right? You have a heavenly rebellion, they go down to the land, and now you're having the culminating earthly rebellion where they're going up, right? And so God scatters them. Which is that right for God to do that? Is it cruel for God to do that? It could be worse, right? If you read stories of gods of their contemporaries, what's the worst they can do? Kill them all, right? Yeah, lightning strike, swallowed up by the ground, or crushed and made into creatures or something like that. But what they get is a severe mercy. They're stopped in their tracks, but they're scattered, right? Right? And so in the New Testament too, though it's the book of Revelation, and there's a beast and the names, and this kind of thing, these tropes will continue on to the imaginations of the authors of Revelation, of the authors of the epistles, right? And in other words, when you get, say, to the book of Revelation, and then you've got Babylon in the shape of what? A serpent, right? The word drakon is just the Greek word for serpent, right? The modern dragon that's fire-breathing, that's medieval, right? That's a medieval story. That's like Shakespeare trumping Kit Marlowe, right? But drakon is just a serpent. It's a sea serpent, right? Like Leviathan, right? And so who's being written... you got Babylon in Revelation, who's being portrayed as a serpent and a woman, right? And who's being written upon by the ultimate deceiving, right? The serpent is being ridden by a deceiving woman. All she says is lies, right? And then behind her is a terrible beast, right? Of power, right? And so if you're somebody who's saturated in the stories of Genesis, what are you thinking the entire time? I know what this is, right? I know these ideas. They're from Genesis. They're from Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and to 11. Every one of those images in Revelation are coming from 1 through 11, right? The deceived woman who becomes the deceiver and coalesces with a serpent and then rides on the back of Babylon, right? Right? And so the deceived woman who becomes the deceiver, right? That's what happens in Genesis 3. She deceives her husband because she was first deceived, right? And who was she deceived by? A reptile, right? And what is that reptile? It's a serpent. In Genesis 4, something more than a beast of the field, something more like chata, right? Something more like sin. And it's like an animal, a lurker of terrible destructive force that's devouring and desiring. And Genesis 6 have these rebellious powers of heaven who take in their desire because they have power, right? And then Genesis 11, right? Which is Babylon. It's all tracking. So this is similar to when Jesus reminds the people in Galilee of the story of Jonah, right? What is John doing with that crazy image that seems to us like a crazy image of a deceiver woman, right? He's seeing the design patterns of Genesis, and he's employing them in different and creative ways. How else would you get an image like that except by recognizing that these are all repetitions from Genesis, right? They're not arbitrary. So anybody who says that Revelation's spooky because it's all really cryptic, they're not reading Genesis. There's no way. John is just writing a political comic using Genesis 1 through 11, right? He's using a graphic novel style imagination, right? And so in his mind, it's all one package deal, the rebellions of heaven and earth. It's almost like when you get to the stuff in the New Testament, You have to stop and reverse engineer everything that you knew from Genesis 1 through 11, right? Seriously, so anytime you read the New Testament, 9 times out of 10, you will go back to the Old Testament and start finding these repetitions. You just have to start making those connections. So when I see the word hyperlink, it's like when you go to a Wikipedia page and you click his father, and you're at a page of, George Bush Jr., right? And then you click his father, you go to senior, right? You go to the past, right? So that's what we're doing in the New Testament, is finding these hyperlinkings back to Old Testament stories. And these language of the narratives are all coming from the same narrative framework. It's just like episode 13 to 75, right? And so that's narrative distance. But they're able to do it because they conceive of this thing as one long, sweeping narrative, right? It's designed. And so this is exactly where I think we start to feel like maybe Genesis 6 and 1 are sort of far from each other. But when you get to Revelation in Genesis 1, it's even further, right? But from the beginning of Psalm 29, the beginning of Psalm 29 is far, right? But you still made sense because the psalm is long. But if you read the psalm correctly, then you see the connection between the looping endings, right? It seems like it starts right back up. In the same way, it makes sense here. We're just working on one example right now, which is just 11 chapters, right? There's a handful of scholars who I've been reading, and a guy named David Andrew Teeter, and a scholar named Jacob Stromberg, and Michael Lyons, and William Tooman. They're working this out as a whole model, as a way of reading the Hebrew Bible. They're standing on the back of John Sailhammer. And they all joke that it's like when you're eating a box of cereal as a kid and you get to the save the coupons so that you could win a toy at the end, right? So that you can get the decoder ring, they'll mail it to you or something like that. And then the more you consume boxes of cereal, the closer you get to the decoder ring. And so when you're reading Old Testament or when you're reading Hebrew Bible, it's like consuming boxes of cereal to where you get closer to getting the decoder ring. So that when you read New Testament, you have the decoder ring for the Hebrew Bible, right? And so this is my experience of rereading repetition as an interpretive tool. You're not just rereading for your own spiritual growth, but you're rereading to build the tolerance for repetition, right? It has to occur to you before you can see it, right? And it will never occur to you if you haven't passed through it multiple times. That's just how it is. It's designed to be passed through multiple times. You should say, man, this is the 15th time I've heard the word tree in this story. I wonder if that matters, right? You have to keep reading. Then that gives you the ability to help unpack why narratives are ordered the way they're ordered. Why is this repetition and then this repetition? Why do they leave the Dead Sea and then there's a song about them leaving the Dead Sea? I mean the Red Sea, right? Why is this a song and why is this a narrative, right? Why the vocabulary is the way that it is. Why did they use that awkward word there, right? Are they meaning to make a connection with something, right? And so that's why you get the interpretations of the Hebrew Bible from the apostles that seem really left field, right? Sometimes the Hebrew, Paul will say something like, and that's why the days are evil, right? What? What are you talking about? The days are evil? What do you mean redeeming the time, right? But he's reflecting on Exodus, right? Because redeeming is, the Greek word for redeeming the time, for the days are evil, the Greek word is ex agora, which means to remove from market, which is to remove a slave from the market. You're no longer for sale, right? And so he's making a connection between the days and the evil or the raw of the days and them being enslaved by something. By what? For Paul, it's the powers, the principalities, the chata, right? Babylon, right? And so we're going to do this more in the coming weeks. We're really wrapping up here. But right now we've seen like the payoff from just Genesis 1 through 11. And then we've seen as a teaser Genesis 1 to Revelation, right? But these are not one-offs, right? There's way more repetition of these things throughout Scripture, right? So we're going to fill out more with some examples in the following sessions. But any thoughts or reflections for the moment? Any thoughts or things that are occurring to you now before we go? So this is one of the slower paced things we've done, right? Is really just crawling through Genesis. But it's the only way to do it, right? There's nothing forward but doing it. So I think the payoff for understanding repetition in this way is that the repetition really underscores the tragedy of things, right? The tragedy of what goes on in Genesis is only underscored when the themes from 3 are repeated throughout the rest of Scripture, like echoes of what happened in Eden. And just as much as there's an echo of the awful things that happened in Eden, there's echoes of beautiful things, just like in Genesis 3:17. What's Genesis 3:17?
Genesis 3:7.
3:15, sorry. Okay, so in the middle, so if we've heard the story of all of the Torah, the Tanakh, many times, if we know the story of the Tanakh and we've been through it many times, there's this portion in Genesis 3:15 that's a very cryptic and unfulfilled prophecy. It's an ultimate prophecy of victory, but it's one verse and it's very cryptic, right? I will put enmity between you, your offspring, and the offspring of the serpent, right? The seed, right? And seed is a repetition of tree, right? Right, so your seed and their seed, there's enmity between you two, right? I'll put it between you guys. But then what? What does it say? Say, just read it. Read the whole thing.
Enmity between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel.
So this is a curse to the snake. This is the curse to the serpent, right? This is the curse to the serpent. I will put enmity between your offspring and hers, right? And she will crush your head, right? Yeah, and you will strike his heel. So there's this really cryptic, you will lose, you will die, and you'll deal a blow, right? It's a serpent, so it's poisonous and you will die. Like that thing will die. So it's a cryptic prophecy of like a mortal blow or a Pyrrhic victory. Like you will lose, you'll strike.
But not to our Catholic brethren.
Yeah.
Because if you see the Immaculate Conception,
Yeah.
it's there.
Yeah.
And there's a snake.
Yeah, Virgin Guadalupe, right? The feast of right. The feast of Guadalupe is where the Virgin Mary of Guadalupe, stomps the heel. If you've ever seen the Passion of the Christ, the very first scene of the Passion of the Christ is a dark, steamy, foggy Garden of Gethsemane, and then there's a boa python in the garden, and then Jesus crushes the heel, right? But he gets bit, right? And so that's Mel Gibson's reflection on what's happening in the Passion. The beginning of the defeat of the serpent happens at the Passion, and the final blow that death deals to Jesus is the cross, right? And so you have this reflection of what this will look like. This is hopeful, but it's not without its misgivings, right? Exactly. We don't know who it is. And so whatever silhouette of the awaiting figure, whatever the silhouette of the coming prophet, priest, king figure is, we hope it includes this one-off promise, right? Of the defeat of the serpent, the root of it all, right? Where it all began, where all of the issues of humanity began at this stealing or the taking of the knowledge of good and of Tov and Ra, right? It's a hopeful image, but also not one without sort of a sorrowful figure. You will deal a death blow to that offspring, right? And how that gets worked out throughout Scripture and the repetitions is challenging and beautiful, right? But we don't really see where it is until the end, right? We see it a little bit in in the garden, I mean in John's telling of the garden, right? He's crucified in the garden, right, by a tree. And so there's things like that that clue us in, but we need to think about it, right? So that's where this kind of study pays off for us, right? Any other thoughts before we close?
Yeah, one other thing is the bronze serpent.
Yeah,
That the idea wherein the serpent should be
in Numbers.
bad, right? But for Moses and during that wandering, and there will be serpents, right? If Moses' hand is not right,
Yeah.
raised with the bronze serpent, then everything is being beaten and they die.
Yeah.
But once it's risen and you look at it,
Yeah.
like, what is the serpent?
Yeah, and that's a really challenging story too, because the serpent is not a good thing so far in the repetition. But for some reason in the story in Numbers, it's the mode of their salvation. It's this bronze serpent. But then does it last? No, because they begin to trust too much in the serpent. Right? It's challenging, and they're doing a lot of things, and it's all based on repetition. And you have to kind of wonder, what are they intending here?
And Jesus Christ will reference that, or will
Mhm.
what's the thing? He will appeal to that.
Yeah.
Just like in during Moses' time when
Yeah, exactly.
the Son of Man will also be
Will be lifted up. Yes, exactly. And so you just have these are clearly important symbolic repetitions and allusions, but they often don't excite those connections for us. But hopefully, by learning what we can do to consciously and intentionally practice the act of reading slowly, we develop the tools to do it. That's it. Yeah. All right. I'll close this in prayer, and then we can close up. All right. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you once again for this time we have to study your word and to reflect on Genesis, Lord. And so as we go into the coming week, I pray that you'll make worthwhile what we learned today to supplement the way that we enter into your word in the week to come. In your name we pray. Amen.